A horse came out of the blizzard screaming, riderless, dragging a half-dead man behind it through 2 feet of Montana snow. A widow with 5 children and a dead husband's rifle threw open the door barefoot and made a choice that would change everything. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. She only knew that a Bellamy doesn't let anything die on their doorstep if they can help it. What she couldn't know was that the bleeding stranger on her floor was about to save the one thing she couldn't save herself, her dying baby girl. This channel is built for hearts that love the American West, the grit of frontier mothers, the quiet courage of broken men finding their way home, and the fierce, tender love that forms between strangers who choose each other in the dark. What this story gives you: a reminder that the people we pull in from the cold are sometimes the very ones who bring the warmth back with them. If that opening stopped your breath even a little, subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments, and share this with someone who needs a good story tonight. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
Josie heard the horse screaming before she ever saw it. She grabbed her late husband's rifle and threw the cabin door open, barefoot in 2 feet of Montana snow. The man was a wreck, his face dragged raw over ice and rock. She cut the stirrup and he dropped like a sack of feed. His coat was torn open, and blood was frozen solid against his skin. The horse, bless its heart, just stumbled toward the barn, running on nothing but memory. "Mama?" It was Hattie, all of 13, holding a kitchen knife. "What are we going to do?" "Get Ezra, now." Josie knelt down and felt for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. She pulled his collar back and got a look at his face. He had a dark beard, a deep gash over one eye, and his hands were clean, which was peculiar. "Mister," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Mister, can you hear me?" His lips moved and she leaned in close. "The horse," he whispered. "Don't let my horse die." Josie rocked back on her heels. The man is half dead, and his first thought is for his horse. That was the same kind of darn fool thing her own husband would have said. "Mama, I ain't bringing a stranger in this house." Ezra, her 11-year-old, stood in the doorway with his daddy's hunting knife in his belt. "Papa said not to." "Your papa also said a Bellamy doesn't let a soul die on their doorstep if they can help it. This is different. Papa ain't here to protect us if this man is bad." Them words hit Josie harder than a slap, mostly because they were true. She looked at her boy, trying so hard to be the man of the house, and saw all the sleepless nights he'd had since his daddy died. "Ezra James Bellamy," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "I've got a rifle. You've got a knife. Your sister has the shotgun. We are not helpless. Now grab his other arm before he freezes solid." Ezra did as he was told, but his hand never strayed far from that knife. They hauled the man inside and laid him by the fire. Josie bolted the door and saw her children ready for a fight. Hattie stood guard over the little ones. Clementine, who hadn't spoken a word since the funeral, just watched with those big dark eyes of hers. And little Birdie was wailing from her crib, each cry a little weaker than the last. "He's bleeding something awful, Mama," Hattie said. Josie pulled back his coat. The cut was deep, running from his ribs down to his hip. She'd stitched up plenty of things in her time, but this was bad. "I need my sewing kit," she said, "and boil the good needle." "You're going to sew him up?" Ezra asked. "Well, I'm not going to let him bleed all over the floor your papa built." She cleaned the wound with whiskey, and the stranger's eyes flew open. He grabbed her wrist with a grip like iron, then let go just as fast. "Easy now," Josie said. "I'm not fixing to hurt you." "Sorry, ma'am," he rasped. "Where am I?" "Bellamy Homestead. Your horse dragged you here." "She found you," he said, a little gratitude showing on his face. "Smart horse." "You got a name, mister?" "Silas. Silas Thorne." "Well, Silas Thorne, I'm about to stick this needle in you. Please don't grab me again." He just nodded. He took 19 stitches without so much as a whimper, just stared at the ceiling and breathed. He took his pain quiet-like he was used to it. "It'll hold," she said when she was done. "That's good work," he said, then stopped himself. From the crib, Bertie let out a wet, rattling cough that made the whole cabin go silent. Josie was by her side in a heartbeat, feeling the terrible heat pouring off her little girl's body. "3 days now," Hattie said right at her elbow. "The fever won't break." Josie knew the doctor was no help. The last person who went to fetch him said he was too drunk to even get on his horse. The baby's breathing sounded like paper tearing, a sound Josie had heard once before, the night her mother-in-law passed. "How old is she?" Silas asked from the floor. "That ain't your concern," Josie snapped back. "Ma'am, how old?" "She's 3. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the look on his face had changed completely. "Her lungs are filling up," he said, his voice sharp and clear. "I can hear it from here, that rattle. If you don't get that fluid out, she'll be gone by morning." "How would you know that?" Josie demanded. "Because I've heard that sound before. I know what it's like when someone's drowning from the inside. Right now, all that matters is I can help your little girl." Ezra stepped right between Silas and the crib. "Mama, don't. We don't know him. Papa trusted a man who got him killed. I ain't trusting some stranger just because he sounds like he knows something." Silas looked straight at the boy. He did not argue or get angry. "You're right, son," he said, his voice calm. "Your daddy taught you to protect your family, and you're doing a fine job. But I'm asking you to listen. Just listen to your sister's breathing, and then you decide what's riskier." The only sound in that cabin was the awful, wet rattle of Bertie fighting for air. Ezra's hand was clenched on his knife so hard his knuckles were white. Finally, he looked at Silas. "Tell me what to do," the boy said. "But I swear, if you hurt her—" "If I hurt her," Silas finished, "you can use that knife. Fair deal. Fair deal." And just like that, they all got to work. Silas was too hurt to stand, so he gave orders from the floor. Hattie boiled water on the stove. Ezra, clever with his hands, rigged up a tent of blankets over the crib. Josie crushed herbs, filling the air with a clean, sharp scent. "More steam," Silas commanded. "We need it thick. For the next hour, she needs to breathe nothing but hot, wet air." "She is just so little," Hattie whispered, her hands trembling as she fixed the blanket tent. "Too little for all this." "Being small is not the same as being weak," Silas said. "Babies are fighters. They do not know how to quit, so they just do not." Suddenly, Clementine was right there beside Josie, holding out a bundle of wild thyme. Josie's breath caught. The girl just pointed to a loose board in the pantry, their mother's secret stash for real trouble. "Good girl," Josie managed to say, adding the herbs to the steam. Bertie's breathing eased just a little bit. "Honey," Silas spoke up. "Warm honey and mint water will soothe her throat." "We have barely got a quarter jar left," Hattie worried. Silas looked her square in the eye. "Use every last drop. You cannot put honey before your sister." Hattie snatched the jar and they got back to work. All through the night they fought for her. Josie dripped honey water onto Bertie's chapped lips while Hattie held her up. Ezra kept the fire blazing, his face set like stone. Little Sam slept soundly, his head resting on the stranger's arm. Clementine just sat by the crib, her hand on Bertie's foot. Twice, the baby quit breathing. The first time lasted 3 seconds, but it felt like 30 years. Silas's calm voice cut through the panic. "Turn her on her side." Josie did it without thinking. Bertie coughed, then let out a scream that was the sweetest music Josie had ever heard. The second time was worse, around 3 in the morning. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 6. Josie froze, clutching her baby. "Pat her back," Silas commanded. "Hard, between the shoulders. I will hurt her. You will save her. Do it, Josie." It was the first time he had said her name. She did not notice until much later. She patted Bertie's back just like he said. The baby coughed up something awful, then took a huge gulp of air. Josie let out one sob, wiped her eyes, and carried on. By dawn, Bertie was breathing steady. The terrible fever had eased. She was sleeping on Josie's chest, clutching a piece of her mama's hair. Silas had finally collapsed, pale as a sheet, his wound bleeding again. He had spent 5 hours saving her child instead of himself. Josie watched him sleep. This man had known just what to do, and had called her by name when she needed it most. "Mama?" Hattie asked, looking worn out. "Who is that man? How did he know all that?" "I do not rightly know," Josie said, "but I aim to find out when he is awake." "He saved her, Mama," Hattie said softly. "No matter what else he is, he did that." "I know," Josie replied, looking from her sleeping baby to the man on the floor. "So we wait, we watch, and we keep the rifle handy." As the morning wore on, everyone slept but Ezra. He had been eyeing the stranger's saddlebags all night, just waiting to prove his suspicions. The first bag held nothing but clothes, bullets, and coffee. But in the second, his fingers found a folded piece of thick paper. It looked official and was creased from being carried for a long time. He unfolded it by the lamp. Printed in bold letters above a drawing of a man was the word, "Wanted, Silas Thorne, for desertion and cowardice. A $500 reward." The face in the sketch was the same one sleeping on their floor. Ezra gripped his knife, his breathing quick. He saw his mama with Bertie, and Sam sleeping next to this wanted man. He tucked the poster in his pocket, sat by the door with his knife, and waited. Silas woke up feeling eyes on him, sharp and unfriendly. He saw the boy, Ezra, sitting a few feet away with a knife on his lap and a dangerous look on his face. "Morning," Silas said. Ezra just stared back. "You are slow to wake. Good. It means you are hurt bad. I can get to my mama before you can get to anybody." Silas noted the boy's position, blocking the door. "Smart. Did your papa teach you that?" "Do not you talk about my papa." "Fair enough. I found what was in your bag," Ezra said, his voice quiet but shaking. The words hit Silas harder than a punch. He knew exactly what the boy meant. He should have burned that poster years ago. "Figured someone would sooner or later," Silas admitted. "Desertion and cowardice," Ezra spat. $500. That is more than my papa made in 2 years. You are a coward who ran." He leaned forward. "And you came in our house and put your hands on my sister. What kind of man pretends to be good when he has got that in his bag?" Silas pushed himself up against the hearth, pain shooting through his side. Silas felt the boy's words hit him like a physical blow, but he refused to let the pain show. He thought, this boy deserves a man who can at least sit up and look him square in the eye. "The kind of man who wasn't planning on being here," Silas said, his voice low. "The kind whose horse found your barn in the middle of a blizzard." "I didn't choose this," Ezra shot back. "But I'm not sorry it happened. My sister is breathing this morning, and she wouldn't have made it without you." "Don't you call me son." "Wouldn't dream of it," Silas replied. Ezra reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. He unfolded it slow, real deliberate. "I'm going to show this to my mama, and then you're leaving. Storm or no storm, stitches or no stitches, you're gone." "That sounds like a decision for your mama, not for you." "Everything in this family is my decision now." The boy's voice cracked just a little on that last word. It was just enough to show the fear and exhaustion hidden under all that toughness he'd built up. "Somebody's got to make the calls. Somebody's got to keep us safe. And it sure ain't gonna be some stranger with a wanted poster in his saddlebags and his blood on my mama's floor." "Ezra," Josie's voice came from behind him. She was standing in the doorway with baby Bertie asleep on her shoulder. Her face was calm, the way a woman's gets when she's heard every single word and is deciding what to do about it. "Mama, look," Ezra said, holding out the poster. Josie walked across the room and took the paper from his hand. She read it over twice. Silas watched her face. He saw the exact moment she understood what it said. Her eyes narrowed just a little. Her free hand pressed a little tighter against Bertie's back. She took one tiny step, putting herself between him and the baby's crib. "Desertion," she said, her voice flat. "Cowardice in the face of the enemy." "Yes, ma'am." "Is it true?" "The desertion part is," Silas admitted, holding her gaze. "I left my unit. I walked away from my post during a retreat." "And the coward part?" "That's a lie. It was told by a man who needed somebody else to blame for his own mistakes. But I can't prove that to you, not standing here in your cabin with a hole in my side and my face on a poster." "Then why in the world should I believe you?" "You shouldn't, not based on my word alone. Words are cheap." He nodded toward the back room where Bertie was breathing. It was still a rough sound, but it was steady. She was alive. "But you heard your daughter breathe last night. You heard me tell you what to do, and it worked. A coward doesn't learn the things I know how to do. A coward runs away from people who are hurting. He doesn't run toward them." Josie was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched until Sam woke up, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Mama, I'm hungry." Hattie started moving around the kitchen, stirring the fire and getting out the oats like she did every morning. "You got 2 days," Josie finally said, "until this storm breaks and you're healed up enough to ride. You don't touch my children. You don't go through our things. You sleep right here where I can see you. And if I find out you lied about a single thing, Ezra isn't the one you need to worry about. Understood?" "Mama," Ezra started to protest. "I heard you, Ezra. I heard every word. And I'm proud of you for finding that poster. And I'm proud of you for standing guard all night. But I'm your mother. This is my house, and this is my call to make." You could see 6 different feelings cross that boy's face in about 2 seconds flat. Then he stood up, shoved his knife back in his belt, and walked right out into the snow without even grabbing his coat. "He's angry," Silas said quietly. "He's been angry for 2 years, Josie replied, shifting Bertie to her other shoulder. "That boy has been carrying this whole family on his back since the day we buried his father. He's breaking under the weight of it. He just won't let anybody see." She looked back at Silas. "Don't mistake my decision for trust, Mr. Thorne. You're staying because my baby needs what you know. The second she doesn't, you're gone." "Wouldn't expect anything less." Hattie set a bowl of oatmeal on the table. Then she turned and placed a second bowl right on the floor next to Silas. Not on the table, on the floor. The message was loud and clear. "Thank you," Silas said. "Don't thank me." Hattie's eyes looked a decade older than she was. "I saw what you did for Bertie last night, and I'm grateful. But being grateful and trusting somebody are 2 completely different animals. I learned that lesson the hard way." "From your father?" "From the man who promised my father the logging job was safe." She turned her back to him. "Papa believed him. And now Papa's dead. You understand me, Mr. Thorne?" "Perfectly." The morning went on with everyone keeping their distance. Josie took care of Bertie while Silas gave instructions from the floor. "More steam. A little less honey this time. Keep her propped up as much as you can." They spoke carefully, like 2 people handling dynamite. It was Sam, all of 6 years old, who finally broke the tension. He walked right up to Silas with a little bowl of melted snow. "For your face," Sam said, holding it out with both hands. "You got cuts all over it. Mama says cuts need cleaning or they'll go bad." "Sam, you leave him be," Hattie called from the kitchen. "But his face is all messed up," Sam insisted. "He's going to scare Bertie when she wakes up." Silas took the bowl. "Much obliged, Sam. That's real thoughtful of you." "Mama says I'm the thoughtful one. Ezra's the tough one, Hattie's the smart one, Clem's the quiet one, Bertie's the little one, and I'm the thoughtful one." Sam sat down on the floor, cross-legged. "What are you?" "Right now? Mostly the injured one." "No, I mean, in your family. Everybody's got a thing." Silas dipped a rag in the cold water and pressed it to a cut on his cheek. The sting felt real, pulling him back from a painful memory Sam's question had stirred up. I was the oldest. I had a sister named Ruth. She was 3 years younger. She was the stubborn one. Where is she? Ohio, last I heard. That's a long way from Montana. Don't you miss her? Every single day. Then why don't you go see her? Silas opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He could feel everyone in the cabin listening. Josie's hands had stopped working. Hattie stood with her back to him, but her shoulders were tense. Because sometimes, Silas said, his voice quiet, a person makes choices that take them so far from home, they can't figure out how to get back, even when they want to. That's dumb, Sam said. You just walk or ride a horse. Mama says every road goes 2 directions. Your mama sounds like a wise woman. She's the best mama in all of Montana. She can shoot a rabbit from 50 yards away and make biscuits that don't taste like rocks. Josie's voice cut in. Sam, go check on the chickens. I know it's snowing, so you check on them fast. Sam looked at Silas with that look every youngest child has when they know they're being sent away from the interesting part. I'll be back. I got more questions. I'll be here. Promise? That word just hung in the air. Silas saw Josie turn her head, a warning in her eyes. Don't you be making promises to my children. I'll be here when you get back from the chickens, Silas said carefully. That's all I can say for sure. Sam seemed to think this was a fair deal, nodded and went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. Mr. Silas, that poster Ezra found. Mama says desertion means you ran away from the army. That's right. Did you run because you were scared? No. Then why'd you run? Because staying meant I would have had to let people die who didn't have to, with that fierce seriousness only a 6-year-old can have. To me, that sounds like the opposite of being a coward. And then he walked out into the snow. Josie finally let out a breath. She knelt to check on Birdie, and Silas could smell the wood smoke in her hair. He asks too many questions, she said quietly. He asks the right ones, Silas replied. Most grown-ups ain't that brave. Don't mistake not knowing any better for bravery. Maybe that's where bravery gets its start. She gave him a hard look, the first real one since she saw that wanted poster. You said you know how it sounds when a person is drowning from the inside. That is not the talk of a hunter. No, ma'am. I won't ask again, but I need to know. Are my children safe here with you? Safer with me than without me, at least until that baby's breathing clear. That is not what I asked. I have never hurt a child in my life, and I would die before I let any harm come to yours. That is the most honest thing I know how to say. Josie stood up, not offering a word of thanks. She did not tell him she believed him. She simply returned to the kitchen to heat more water. But she left the rifle leaning against the far wall instead of at her hip. Silas understood. For a woman like Josie Bellamy, that was as close to trust as he was going to get. By afternoon, Birdie's fever had dropped. The whole cabin felt like it could breathe again as a stranger found his place in their quiet rhythm. Ezra came inside, his arms piled high with enough split wood to last 2 days. He had been chopping since sunrise in the biting cold, and his hands were raw and cracked. He dropped the wood by the stove without looking at anyone. "Thank you, Ezra," Josie said. He just grunted. "Your hands," Silas said. "I have a salve." "I don't need anything from you," the boy shot back. "Suit yourself. But a family that needs a boy who can fix things can't afford for him to lose the feeling in his fingers." Ezra's jaw was tight. He stared at the fire for a long moment, then stood and held his hands out to Silas. Silas took them, his own hands moving with a practiced ease. "Nothing permanent," he said, checking the circulation. "But you need tallow and wrappings on these tonight. And wear gloves next time. Gloves have a hole in them." "I can fix that," Hattie called from the kitchen. She brought a jar of tallow over. "You show me how to wrap them proper." and I will remember." Silas showed her, and she watched with a sharp focus, her quick hands learning the motions. He could see she was the one who had been patching this family up long before he showed up. "You are good at this," Silas told her. "I am good at anything that keeps my family alive," she replied, her voice firm. "Mama cannot do it all." "That is a heavy load for 13. Did not ask for your opinion on my load, Mr. Thorne." "No, ma'am, you surely did not." Clementine had watched it all, from her place by the window. Silas was starting to figure it out. She did not speak. But she got up, went to a shelf, and brought back a pair of leather gloves with a tear in the thumb. She placed them beside Silas without a look, then went back to her window. "That is the most she has said to anyone outside this family in 2 years," Hattie said in a low voice. "She stopped talking the day Papa died." Silas picked up the gloves. They were a father's gloves, brought by a daughter who found a way to speak without making a sound. "I will fix these tonight," he said. The quiet in the room was his only answer. Silas knew something had shifted. It was not trust, not yet. But a door that had been barred was now just closed, and a closed door can be opened. That night, the wind howled and threw snow against the cabin walls. Josie put the children to bed, one by one. Hattie read from her mother's worn recipe book by the lamplight. Ezra sat guard by the door with a knife on his knees, his gaze fixed on Silas. "You can get some sleep," Silas told him. "I'm not going anywhere." "That is what I'm afraid of," the boy said. Josie brought fresh bandages and tended to his wound with steady hands. He could see the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide from her children. "Bertie's breathing is better," she said. "She will need the steam for 3 more days, maybe 5. "Then I guess you are stuck with me longer than 2 days." "I guess so." She tied the bandage. "My husband is dead because he believed a liar. I do not have that luxury anymore. I have got 5 children, and 40 acres and a town that thinks I should sell out. Are they wrong?" "Maybe not about the winter, but about selling." Her chin came up. "Robert Bellamy built this place. He is buried on that ridge out back. My children were born in this very room. I am not leaving. Nobody is asking you to." "Virgil Crane," she said, the name like a bad taste. "He owns half this valley, and has been after our land since before Robert died. Our creek is the only one that does not freeze solid. He offered to buy us out 3 times. The last time, he sent his men to pull up our fence posts, saying 20 acres of our land was his. I rode to town with our deed, and the judge made him back down. But he will try again." Silas knew men like Virgil Crane, men who believed their money made them right. "How many men does Crane have?" 8, 10 sometimes. "And what have you got?" he asked. "An 11-year-old with a knife and a 13-year-old with a recipe book. I only need 1 rifle for 10 men, and I don't miss a shot. Now, I never said I had a plan, Mr. Thorne. I just said I wasn't fixing to leave." From across the room, Ezra stayed planted by the door. But Silas could see the boy was angled, just so, taking in every word. He wasn't just a guard. He was gathering information. "Your boy is listening," Silas said in a low voice. "My boy is always listening. It's what keeps him awake at night." Josie stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "You best get some rest, Mr. Thorne. Bertie will need another treatment before the sun comes up." She walked to the back room but stopped in the doorway. "You asked if my children were safe here with you. I noticed you never got around to saying what you're running from." "No, ma'am, I surely didn't. Whenever you're ready to tell me that story, I'll be here to listen. Just don't you wait too long. Secrets out here have a bad habit of showing up at the worst possible time." Then the door closed, and Silas listened to the storm and the steady breath of a little 3-year-old girl a stranger had managed to save. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a stack of letters he had carried for 6 long years. Every last one was unopened, with his sister Ruth's handwriting on the front. Ezra watched him holding those letters but didn't say a thing. The storm howled outside, and inside the Bellamy cabin, 6 folks who did not trust each other one bit settled into a quiet that felt against all good sense, like the start of something new. 4 days into the blizzard, little Birdie sat up all by herself and grabbed a hold of Josie's braid. The sound her mama made, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, got everyone on their feet. "She's hungry," Hattie said, already getting the broth. "Mama, she's actually hungry." "I can see that." Josie's voice trembled, but her hands were steady as she lifted Birdie up. The baby fussed and grabbed for anything she could, her eyes clear and filled with the fury of a 3-year-old who had been still for far too long. Sam ran over and buried his face in Birdie's leg. "She's better, mister. Silas, she's all better." "You fixed her." "Your mama fixed her," Silas said from his spot by the fire, his face finally getting some color back. "I just gave some advice. She did all the hard work." "That ain't the truth," Hattie said without even looking at him. "And every person in this cabin knows it." Ezra kept quiet. He just sat in his chair by the door, whittling a stick down to nothing. But Silas saw the boy's eyes were on Birdie now, watching his baby sister. "Ezra," Josie said, "come hold your sister a minute. I'm busy. You're making sawdust. Now come hold Birdie." He came over and took the baby with a rough gentleness. Birdie grabbed his ear and gave it a good yank, and the corner of Ezra's mouth twitched. That was almost a smile. "Ow! Quit that, Bird." "Bah!" Birdie chirped. "That ain't my name." "Bah! She's saying your name," Sam declared. "She's saying Ezra. She's just saying nonsense." Silas listened to them bickering and felt something he had kept locked away for 6 years start to crack open. The sound of family. He thought about his Sarah, who was Birdie's age when she learned to say his name. She called him Silas since she could not manage the L. Mr. Thorne. Hattie was standing over him with a new bandage. "Time to change that dressing. Mama says I should learn how, since I'll need to do it after you leave." The words were a clear reminder that this whole arrangement had an end date. "You pull the old one off first," Silas told her. "Go slow." She worked with a steady hand, looking at the wound with interest instead of getting squeamish. "It's closing up clean," she said. "Your mama's stitching. Told you she had good hands. She has good everything. She just doesn't hear it enough." Hattie started rewrapping the wound. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question. That poster says cowardice. Ezra thinks that means you ran from a fight. But when Birdie stopped breathing, you talked Mama through it so calm, like you'd done it 100 times. She tied off the new bandage. Cowards don't sound the way you sounded. So either that poster is lying, or cowardice means something different from what I think. The poster's not wrong about what I did. I left my unit right in the middle of a battle. That's called desertion. But why? Why would you leave?" Silas was quiet for a second. He knew Josie was in the kitchen listening without ever looking up from her work. "There were families stuck on the wrong side of a bridge," he said. "Women and children. My commanding officer gave the order to leave them behind. He said the mission was more important. And you went back for them. I went back. Did they make it? Every single one of them. And the Army punished you for that. The Army needed someone to blame for a retreat that went bad. A surgeon who left his post to save folks made for an easy target." Hattie sat back on her heels. "A surgeon? So you are a doctor. Mama thought so. I could tell by how she watched you with Birdie, trying to figure out how a stranger knew more medicine than our own doctor. Dr. Finch was likely a good doctor once. Liquor can steal a man's foundation 1 spoonful at a time. That's a kind way of saying he's useless now. It's an honest way of saying he's hurting." Hattie looked at him for a long moment. "You know what I think, Mr. Thorne? I think you're the kind of man who just can't help but try to fix broken things. And I reckon that's what got you into this mess in the first place." On the 5th day, the storm finally broke. A little crack of blue sky opened up and Sam hollered with joy. The world outside was buried in snow, but the fight had gone out of the wind. "The trail to town should be clear by tomorrow," Josie said, standing in the doorway. "Day after, for sure." "Good," Ezra said from his chair. "The sooner the better." Josie didn't answer him. She turned to Silas. "You're healing fast." Those stitches can come out in about a week. I can take them out myself. I'm sure you can, but I put them in, and I'll be the one to take them out. There's something I need to tell you, Silas said, before that trail opens up. Josie sat down at the table. I've been waiting. You know about the poster and that I left my unit. What you don't know is who I left it for. He took a slow breath. A man named Colonel James Harrison was in charge of our regiment at Willow Creek. When the enemy line broke through, Harrison lost his nerve. He ordered everyone to retreat and told us to abandon the civilians by the bridge, and you refused the order. I crossed back over that bridge under fire, got those families loaded onto wagons, and I led them to safety. 12 people, the day after tomorrow, at the latest. Good, Ezra said from his chair. The sooner the better. Josie ignored him and turned to Silas. You are healing fast. Those stitches can come out in a week. I can take them out myself. I am sure you can, but I put them in, so I will take them out. It was a fact, not a choice. A week meant he was staying. There is something I have to tell you, Silas said, before that trail opens up. Josie sat at the table. I have been waiting. You saw the poster. You know I left my unit, but you do not know why. He took a breath that strained his stitches. Our commander was a man named Colonel James Harrison. When the line broke at Willow Creek, he panicked. He ordered a full retreat. He told us to abandon the civilians who were sheltered by the bridge. And you disobeyed. I went back across that bridge under fire. I loaded those families, 12 people, onto wagons and got them to safety, including 4 children. By the time I made it back to our lines, my commander, Harrison, had already written his report. He said I deserted under fire. He said my cowardice caused the whole retreat. He needed someone to blame. And a field surgeon who disobeyed a direct order was mighty convenient. Couldn't you tell your side of the story? To who? Harrison had the rank, the connections, and the official paperwork. All I had was the word of a dozen terrified folks who scattered as soon as they were safe. There was no trial, no hearing, just a warrant and a price on my head. Josie's hands were flat on the table, still as stone. And Harrison? What happened to him? Last I heard, he's a congressman now, building a big reputation on a war record that's mostly make-believe. So, the coward who left those families to die is sitting in Washington pretending to be a hero, Josie said slowly, while the man who saved them is sleeping on my floor with a hole in his side. That about sums it up. The cabin was quiet. Silas could hear Birdie making happy baby noises in the other room. He could hear the fire crackle. They were normal sounds, safe sounds. He had almost forgotten what that felt like. I had a daughter, he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Her name was Sarah. She was 4. My wife's name was Catherine. After the warrant I ran, I told myself I was protecting them by staying away. I thought if the army could not find me, they would leave my wife and daughter alone. His voice went hollow. Diphtheria took them both that winter. I was miles away hiding while my family died without a doctor. Josie gasped. I could have saved them, he continued. That is what I live with. Not the war, not that poster. I was not there because I was hiding from a lie. His gaze met Josie's. My name is Silas, and I am a man who let his family die to save his own skin. That is worse than anything on that paper. No, Josie's voice cut in, sharp as glass. It is not. A disease killed them. A crooked officer stole your name and your chance to be there. You are carrying a weight that belongs to another man, and I will not let you. Silas just stared at her. You do not know me well enough to say that. I know I watched you for 5 hours on my floor with a hole in your side, talking my baby back to life. Night of her life. You taught my daughter how to wrap up frostbitten hands. You did not even flinch when my boy pulled a knife on you. You patched up my dead husband's gloves just because a little girl who has not said a word in 2 years asked you to without a sound. Josie's eyes were burning. You want to tell me you are some kind of coward? You go tell that story to someone who has not seen you in action." They sat in silence for a good long while. The little cabin was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of children breathing and a fire crackling low. "Mama." Clementine was standing in the doorway. By the still way she held herself, Silas knew she had heard every last word. Josie turned. "What is it, darling?" Clementine crossed the floor without a sound. She stopped right in front of Silas and looked up at him with those big, dark eyes. He could feel her gaze on him like a heavy blanket, judging him, sizing him up. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a little wooden bird. It was carved by loving hands and worn smooth from being held for years. She just placed it in Silas's palm, no ceremony, no explanation. Then she walked right back to her corner and sat down. "That was Papa's," Hattie said from across the room. "He carved it for her the day she was born. She has not let another soul touch it since he passed." Silas held that little bird and felt its weight, not in his hand, but deep down inside him. "Thank you, Clem," he said, his voice low. She did not look at him, but she lifted a hand and pressed it flat against the window pane. It was her way of showing something was too big to keep inside. The trail finally cleared 2 days later, and Trouble came riding right up with it, wearing a fine coat and an easy grin. Josie saw the two riders first. "Crane," she said, and the name tasted like ash in her mouth. Silas was already on his feet, sore but steady. Josie grabbed the rifle. "Hattie, get the children in the back room." "Mama, I want to stay." "Take them now." Hattie did as she was told, gathering up the little ones. Ezra, he did not budge. "I'm staying," he said. Josie looked at her son, at the knife tucked in his belt, and the hard set of his jaw. "Fine," she said, "but you stand behind me and you keep your mouth shut." Virgil Crane rode up to the porch like he owned the whole world. He was a tall man with silver hair and a face that looked kind until you saw the coldness in his eyes. Next to him was a thick-necked fella with a deputy's badge on his coat. "Mrs. Bellamy," Crane said, tipping his hat. "Glad you all made it through the storm." "We did just fine." Crane's gaze slid past her to Silas. "Didn't know you had company." "Just a traveler, caught in the storm. He'll be moving on." Crane swung down from his horse. "Name's Virgil Crane. And you are?" Silas looked at him hard. "Funny, most folks who are just passing through have a name." Crane's smile got thin. The deputy put his hand on his pistol. "Mrs. Bellamy, I came to make you another offer," Crane said, pulling a paper from his coat. "A generous one. $300 for this homestead and all 40 acres. This land ain't for sale, Mr. Crane. Ma'am, be reasonable. You've got 5 children and no husband. How long till the next storm takes one you can't save? You don't get to use my children to scare me." "I am not trying to scare you. I am trying to help." "A woman in my position," she said, her voice hard as iron, "built this place with her husband, buried him on that ridge, and kept 5 children alive through the worst winter this territory has ever seen. I don't need your help, your money, or your opinion." Crane's eyes turned to ice. His friendly mask fell away, revealing a man who was used to getting his way and was just calculating the cost of this particular purchase. "The offer stands," he said, "but you ought to know, Mrs. Bellamy, the territorial surveyor is coming this spring. There are some real questions about the property lines around here. A woman without the money for a good lawyer might find herself on the short end of the stick." Josie stared him down. "Is that a threat, Mr. Crane?" "That's information. There is a difference." He swung onto his horse, giving Silas one last cold look. "And I would watch the company you keep. Folks out here do not take kindly to strangers with something to hide." They watched him ride off. Ezra's hand had been gripping his knife the whole time. "He knows," the boy breathed out, "about the poster." "He does not know a thing yet," Josie said. "But men like him make it their business to find out, and they use what they learn." Silas stood there watching Crane shrink into the snowy distance. He knew that kind of man. They wore different faces, but underneath, they were all the same as Harrison, bullies who used the law like a club. "I ought to leave," he said quietly, "before I make things worse for you all." Josie turned, flakes of snow still caught in her hair. She looked bone-tired, like a person who had fought alone for so long she had forgotten what help felt like. "Are you fixin' to run again, Silas Thorne?" "I'm fixin' to keep you out of my trouble. My family has been feeding your trouble for a week now. It is a little late to keep us out of it." She held up a hand. "Do not you dare say my name all soft like that, and then tell me you are leaving. I have had one man leave me, and he did not have a choice. If you are going to go, then go. But do not you pretend it is for my sake." Ezra looked from his mother to Silas, and something hard in the boy's face seemed to crack. "He is right, Mama. If Crane finds out about that poster, he will have the law here in a day." "I know that," Josie said. "So, what is the plan?" She looked at her son, then at Silas, and then around the cabin her husband had built with his own 2 hands. "The plan is we stop running, all of us." She grabbed the rifle and put it back by the door where it belonged. "The plan is we learn how to fight back." For Josie, fighting meant riding into Elkhorn Creek the next morning with her land deed in her coat. For Silas, it meant writing a letter he should have penned 6 years ago. And for Ezra, it meant watching his mother ride off, hating that she was leaving him with the very man whose face was on a wanted poster in his pocket. "She trusts you," Ezra said to Silas, not even turning around. "She trusts that I will keep you safe. That is not the same thing." "Close enough. What happens when Crane finds out who you really are?" "He will use it," Silas said, "same as he uses everything else, to get what he wants." "And what happens to us?" Silas heard what the boy was really asking. "What happens to my family because of you?" He deserved the truth. "If Crane turns me in, they will arrest me. They will likely threaten your mother with charges to force her to sell the land. Crane gets what he wants, and your family gets nothing. So we lose everything." "Not if we get a move on first," Silas said, holding up a sealed envelope. "I wrote a letter to a man named Tom Morrison. He served with me in the war. He was at Willow Creek Bridge, and he saw what really happened. I am betting he has carried the weight of his silence ever since." He looked at Ezra straight on. "If this letter gets to him, and if he is the man I remember, that poster will not matter anymore. If he is not, I will be gone before Crane can use me against your mother. That is a promise." "You are making a lot of promises for a wanted man." "They are the only ones I have left." Ezra took the letter. "I will take it to the post office. Mama left me the mule." "Your mother told me to keep you right here." "She told you to keep us safe," Ezra shot back. "Getting this letter mailed is the safest thing I can do." He pulled on his father's old gloves, the ones Silas had mended for him, and walked out to the barn. "Besides, somebody has got to go to town. Might as well be the one who knows every shortcut." Silas watched him go, feeling a small shift. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a start. Inside, Hattie ran the house like a seasoned general, her voice a calm anchor as she read from her grandmother's recipe journal. "Mama Crawford says the best bread comes from patience and warm hands," she read aloud. "Says you cannot rush the rising any more than you can rush healing. They both take the time they take." "That is a smart woman," Silas said. "The smartest," Hattie agreed, setting her spoon down. "I heard what you told Mama last night. About your little girl. Sarah. Her name was Sarah Catherine. And you think you could have saved her. I know I could have. Diphtheria can be beat if you catch it early. I knew what to do, same as we did for Bertie. I had all the knowledge," his voice broke. "I just was not there to use it." Hattie was quiet for a moment, her gaze steady. "My papa was in the room when that tree fell. He was standing 10 feet away. All the knowledge in the world would not have saved him. Sometimes the thing that gets you does not care what you know." She picked up her spoon again. You carry that guilt because you think you had a choice. But guilt is a hungry thing, Mr. Thorne. You feed it for too long, and it will eat up everything else inside you. Just then, Sam came barreling through the door, wrestling a chicken. "Hattie Margaret got out again," he yelled. Silas could not help but let out a laugh. The sound was so strange it startled him. He could not remember the last time he had truly laughed. "See," Sam said, beaming at him, "Mr. Silas thinks it is funny." "Mr. Silas thinks you are about to lose a finger," he chuckled. "Now put that hen back." Sam dragged the squawking chicken outside, talking to it the whole time. In the quiet that followed, little Clementine came and sat on the floor near Silas. She held the small wooden bird her father had carved for her in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other. On the stone of the hearth, she began to draw. Slowly, carefully, an image started to take shape. A small cabin, a family, and smoke rising from the chimney like a prayer. Silas watched Clementine draw 6 figures, one taller than the rest, all lined up neat as you please. Some things just don't need talking about. Josie rode back from town with a face like thunder. She swung off her horse, tossed the reins to Hattie, and marched right past Silas into the cabin. He heard the rifle clang on the table, the scrape of a chair, and then a heavy quiet. He gave her 5 minutes before he went inside. It happened. Crane went straight to Judge Pwitt and filed a challenge to our land. Says a surveyor is coming from Helena in 2 weeks. He's also been spreading poison, telling folks I have a strange man living here with my children. Agnes Whitfield told me half the town thinks I've gone crazy. She said a good widow woman doesn't let strange men sleep under her roof. She said if I can't run this place by myself, I ought to find my children a proper family. Josie's jaw clenched tight. A proper family. Like the one they had wasn't enough just because it was missing a man. Crane is turning the whole town against you before that surveyor even gets here. And it's working. I saw it in their eyes. Folks I've known for years looked at me like I was something dirty. You saved your daughter's life. I let a stranger into my home. Out here, for a woman on her own, that's more than enough to get you judged. The back door creaked open and Ezra came in, stomping snow from his boots. He went right to his mother. "Letters sent. I also heard some things in town. Crane's deputy, a fella named Wyatt Polk, was talking loud in the saloon about a reward poster for an army deserter. He said he heard one might be hiding out in this valley. If we can just hold Crane off for 2 weeks, we can fight his claim. But we need the original survey papers, the ones Robert filed in Helena back in 1871. Helena is a 4-day ride, and that's if the weather's good." "I'll go," Silas said. Josie stopped her pacing. "You? The man with a wanted poster hanging over his head is going to ride 4 days through winter mountains? I'm the only one who can. You can't leave 5 children, and Ezra's too young for that ride. Those papers are the only thing that proves Crane is a liar. If someone recognizes you, I'll handle it. Right now, this land is more important than my freedom. Don't you say that. It's not about the dirt, Josie. It's about your children having a home. It's about Birdie growing up where her daddy built something for her. I've spent 6 years protecting nothing but myself. Let me protect something that truly matters." "You come back," Josie said. "You get those papers and you come right back here. That's the price of you going." "I'll come back," he promised. He left before the sun was up. Josie had packed him food they couldn't spare and bandages she might need. Sam hugged his leg and said, "Bring back candy." Clementine pushed a folded piece of paper into his hand. He didn't open it until he was a mile out, the horse pushing through deep snow. It was her drawing of the 6 figures and their cabin. Underneath, in a child's shaky hand, were the first words she had written in 2 years. "Come home." He tucked the paper into his pocket and rode toward Helena with a feeling he thought had died a long time ago. Ezra watched from the barn until Silas was just a speck on the horizon. Then he went inside, bolted the door, and sat in his chair with his knife. This time the knife was pointed at the door. 3 days crawled by. Josie worked herself to the bone, refusing to stop. On the 4th morning, Crane came back, and he brought 4 men with him. They spread out around the cabin like they were ready for a fight. Crane got off his horse and walked up to the porch holding a paper. "Mrs. Bellamy, I have a court order from Judge Pewitt. It's an injunction. Means you can't use the 20 acres he's claiming until the surveyor gets here. Josie took the paper. The 20 acres in question includes our well, Mr. Crane. You know that. I just know what the law says, ma'am. The law says whatever you paid Judge Pewitt to say. Watch your mouth, Mrs. Bellamy. Accusing a judge is a serious thing, almost as serious as hiding a wanted man. Wyatt here has been talking to the marshal's office. Seems there's a $500 reward for a man named Silas Thorne, an Army deserter. He wouldn't still be around here, would he? There's no one here but me and my children. Is that right? Crane nodded to his deputy. Wyatt, why don't you go have a look around? You are not coming in my house. Ma'am, the law says he can search if he has a good reason to think you're harboring a fugitive. Ezra stepped, and I've got a rifle that says he does not. The yard went silent. The boy stood there on the porch, aiming Robert Bellamy's hunting rifle right at Wyatt Polk's chest. His hands were rock-steady. His face was cold calm, like a man who had already decided where he was going to make his last stand. Ezra, Josie whispered, put that down. No, Mama. Ezra James, they are not setting foot in our house. They are not taking our water, and they sure are not touching anything Papa built. The rifle held true. I am 11 years old, and I have been the man of this house for 2 years. I am done letting folks take what is ours. Crane held up a hand to stop his men. Son, you do not want to do this. I am not your son, and you do not know a thing about what I want. Ezra. Josie's voice changed, dropping low and fierce in a way only her children knew. Lower that rifle. Not because they are right, but because you are better than this. Your papa did not raise a boy to shoot men on his own porch. He raised a boy who finds another way. The rifle stayed up, his breath coming hard, his eyes full of fear and fury. There is another way, Josie insisted. There is always another way, trust me. Slow as molasses, Ezra lowered the rifle, his whole body shaking from the strain. Crane just smiled. Smart boy. Now, Mrs. Bellamy, about that search. That will not be necessary. A new voice cut in from the trail. Everyone turned to see a rider approaching at a calm pace. He sat tall in the saddle, a man used to being in charge. Another man followed, carrying a leather case. I am Thomas Harding, the first man said, getting off his horse. I am an attorney, retained by Mrs. Josephine Bellamy 3 days ago. Josie stared, completely baffled. She had not hired any lawyer. Harding kept talking, his voice carrying the weight of a man who argued in rooms far tougher than this. I have looked at your injunction, Mr. Crane, and I am here to challenge it. The original survey documents, which my associate here picked up yesterday, clearly show Mrs. Bellamy's property lines, filed by her late husband in 1871. There is no dispute. There has never been a dispute. Any more trouble from you will be met with a countersuit for harassment and fraud. Crane's face turned pale. Who hired you? That is between me and my client. But this is not. Harding pulled another paper from his coat. It is a formal complaint to the territorial governor about Judge Pewitt issuing that injunction without checking the records. The governor does not take kindly to judges like that. Crane's men started to back away from their guns. The situation had changed, and everyone knew it. This is not over, Crane growled. Actually, as far as the property goes, it very much is, Harding replied. Now, I suggest you and your men get off Mrs. Bellamy's land before I add trespassing to the complaint. Crane got on his horse, giving Josie a look that promised trouble later. But he left. As his men followed, the only sounds left were the wind and the baby fussing inside. Ezra finally let out a ragged breath and lowered the rifle. Josie turned to the lawyer. I did not hire you. No, ma'am. But a man named Silas Thorne came to my office 4 days ago, half frozen and bleeding. He told me a good woman in Elhorn Creek was about to lose her home over water rights. Harding then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He also asked me to give you this. Josie took the letter. Her name was on it, written in a hand she knew well. She waited until the lawyer was gone and the cabin was quiet. She waited until the kids were settled, with Ezra sitting in his chair, the rifle on his lap. But for the first time in a long while, the hard look in his eyes was gone. He looked like a boy again. In the lamplight, she opened the letter from Silas Thorne. The documents are real. The lawyer is paid through the spring. I am coming back, but if I do not, know that your family gave me something I thought was gone forever, a reason to stop running. Josie folded the letter and held it to her heart. Mama? Ezra was watching her. Is he coming back? He says he is. Do you believe him? Josie looked at her fierce, brave son, who had stood down 4 men to protect them all. The boy who had carried a wanted man's letter just because it was the right thing to do. I do, she said. Ezra gave a single nod. He then pulled his father's old gloves, the ones Silas had mended, and set them on the table for when the stranger returned. Outside, the Montana sky was clear, filled with cold, bright stars. And somewhere on the trail, a man who had been running from everything was finally riding towards something. A warm cabin, 5 children, and a woman who told him not to say her name soft unless he meant it. And God help him, he meant every word. Silas finally rode in on the 8th day. The horse came first, just like she did the night this all began. Josie saw them from the window and set down the rifle she had been keeping by the door. She did not run out. She just stood in the kitchen and took a deep breath for what felt like the first time in a week. Hattie looked up. He is back. I see that. Well, go on out there, Mama, go. Josie put on her coat and stepped onto the porch. Silas got down from his horse slowly, favoring his left side even more than before. He was thinner and his coat was torn, but he was here. And when he looked at her, his eyes held a new kind of certainty. You are late, she said. I got delayed. 4 days delayed. The kind of delay that involves federal marshals and a powerful man who wants the truth buried. He tied up the horse, but I brought something back besides the lawyer. He held up a thick leather folder. Tom Morrison, my old sergeant. He had been holding on to evidence of what really happened at Willow Creek for 12 years, just waiting for someone to ask. Witness statements, his own testimony, the original battle reports showing all the lies. Silas's hand trembled a little. It is all here, Josie. Everything I need to clear my name. Josie looked from the folder to the man holding it. Come inside. You look like you are about to fall over. I have been falling over for 8 days, have not hit the ground yet. Do not start now. I just swept. But before he could get through the door, Sam hit him in a full-body hug. The little boy had been watching from the window. You came back. You said you might not, but I knew you would because you promised. And you are almost a Bellamy now. Sam, let the man breathe, Hattie called from the kitchen. But she was smiling, really smiling for the first time in ages. A real smile. Something Silas hadn't seen on her before. It made her look like the young girl she was supposed to be. I don't live here, Silas said, setting Sam down. I'm just... If you say passing through, I swear I will hit you with this spoon, Hattie said. Bertie, sitting by the fire, looked up and held out her arms right to him. Bah, she said. She's been saying that all week, Hattie told him. Sam thinks it's your name. It's not his name, Ezra grumbled from his chair. But he was standing up now, and his knife was on the table. Thank you for sending that letter, Silas told the boy. It made all the difference. Ezra just shrugged. Didn't do it for you, did it for Mama. I know, that's why it counts. Clementine came out from the back room. She walked right up to Silas, reached in his pocket, and took out her drawing. She unfolded it, looked at it for a long moment, and then looked up at him, her eyes asking a question she still couldn't say out loud. I kept it with me the whole time, Silas told her. Right here. Clem took her drawing and pinned it to the wall next to her father's Bible. Then she went to her window and pressed her hand against the glass. Reckon that means you passed, Hattie whispered. That night, after the children were asleep, Josie sat with Silas and read through the evidence page by page. This is enough, she said, her voice quiet. More than enough. Morrison thinks so, too. He's got a federal judge in Cheyenne, a man named Worthington, ready to look at it all. And Harrison? His people know something's coming. That is why I was late. 2 hired guns picked up my trail. Same kind of men Crane keeps around. Josie's face went pale. They found you? They found me. But Josie, this all connects. Crane's deputy Wyatt. Polk. Morrison said he served under Harrison in the war. They are not 2 separate problems. Crane is doing Harrison's dirty work in this valley, getting land and power for him. Robert's homestead, she said, his name catching in her throat. He picked this land for the water, said whoever controlled the creek controlled the valley. Your husband was a smart man. My husband was a good man, she corrected him. There's a difference. Smart men protect themselves. Good men protect everybody else. She looked right at him. You remind me of him. It is the thing I like least about you, because it is dangerous, because it gets people killed. She reached out and touched his hand. Don't you get killed, Silas. These children cannot lose another person. I am not planning on it. Robert was not planning on it either. He turned his hand over, his fingers closing around hers. I am not Robert. I have spent 6 years learning how to survive. And now I have something to come back to. She did not pull her hand away. The reckoning came 12 days later. It was a morning so cold the air felt like it might shatter. Riders, Mama! Ezra burst through the door, his face pale. 8 of 'em, coming up the trail fast. Silas was on his feet in an instant. It is Crane, the boy panted. And Polk, and others. They are all armed. Josie did not hesitate. Hattie, children to the root cellar, now! Mama, I am not hiding. Hattie May, you take your brothers and sisters and you don't come out till I come get you, you hear me? Hattie nodded, her face grim. She gathered up Sam and Bertie and reached for Clementine, but the little girl would not move. Clem, come on, Hattie begged. But Clementine just stood at the window, her small hand pressed flat against the cold glass, watching. Trouble was on its way, but she stood her ground, calm as a Sunday morning. The little girl, Clementine, looked at Silas, then walked right past him. She went to the shelf and took down a bird her father had carved from wood. She pressed it into Hattie's hand, not Silas's. Then she pointed to the root cellar, then to herself, and gave her head a firm shake. Hattie understood. She wants to stay here, she said. Josie's heart clenched. Absolutely not. But Clementine just looked at her mama with those big, knowing eyes. She held up both hands, all 10 fingers spread wide. Then she pointed to Josie and held up 1 finger. 1. She pointed to Silas. 2. Then to Ezra. 3. And last to herself. 4. Ezra's voice was raspy. She's only 8 years old, but she's counting our fighters. She's saying we need every last one of us. And Lord, he was right. Josie shut her eyes for a heartbeat. When she opened them, she was still a mother, but she was also the woman who survived a hard Montana winter on nothing but grit. Clem, you stay by that back window. You watch and you don't move. Ezra, you're on the porch with me. Silas, you be ready. Crane rode up, confident as a fox in a henhouse, with Polk on one side and a hired gun on the other. Behind them, 5 more men spread out like they'd done this 100 times before. Mrs. Bellamy, Crane shouted, I'm here with the authority of the territorial marshals to search your land for a wanted man. Step aside and no one gets hurt. Josie didn't budge. Let me see that warrant. Crane flashed a piece of paper. That judge's signature ain't worth the ink it's written with, and you know it. Your pet judge is already being looked into by the governor. Any paper he signs is useless. That's for the lawyers to figure out, Crane sneered. Right now I have a legal paper and 8 men. All you have is a porch. She's also got me. Silas stepped out from the cabin to stand beside Josie. And I reckon I'm the man you're looking for. You can drop the act about the law. Crane's eyes narrowed. Silas Thorne. Deserter. Coward. $500 on your head. Silas shot back. Surgeon, soldier, the man who saved 12 people while your friend Harrison ran for the hills. He held up a leather folder. And I've got the proof. The yard fell silent. You could hear the wind whistle. Polk's hand drifted toward his gun. Whatever you've got in there doesn't change this warrant, Crane said, trying to get his footing back. Polk, go get him! As Polk swung off his horse, Ezra stepped up and raised his rifle. I wouldn't do that if I were you, the boy said, his voice steady. Son, you put that down before somebody gets hurt. Ezra's eyes were cold. The last man who called me son on this porch didn't like how things ended. Josie laid a hand on the rifle barrel, not to lower it, but to steady her boy. Hold on, she whispered. Then, from the back of the house, a sound came that froze every man in his tracks. A voice, high and clear, but cracked from not being used, like a rusty gate swinging open after years. They're coming! It was Clementine shouting with the force of 2 years of silence. Mama, more riders! From the north! A whole lot of them! Josie whipped around. Silas moved to the side of the house and looked north. He saw a cloud of dust and snow rising from the town trail. Through it came a long line of riders, not 8, but closer to 15, all riding with purpose. Crane saw them too, and the confidence drained right out of his face. The lead rider broke away and galloped straight for the cabin. It was Agnes Whitfield who ran the town diner. She was on a draft horse that was almost too big for her, but she rode it like she was born to it. Behind her were folks Josie knew, shopkeepers, ranchers, the blacksmith, and the school teacher. Morning, Virgil, Agnes called out, reining in her big horse with an authority that made Crane's arrival look like a child's game. Heard you were planning to pay the Bellamys a visit. Figured you could use some company. Crane sputtered. This is official business, Agnes. It's none of your concern. Everything that happens in this valley is my concern, she said flatly. I feed half the people in it. Agnes looked at Josie, and in that one look, an apology passed between them for all the weeks of gossip. I also had a visitor yesterday, a federal judge named Worthington. He had some mighty interesting things to say about you, Virgil, about your ties to a congressman named Harrison, about land fraud and a 12-year plot to silence the man standing on that porch. Crane's face turned the color of ash. I don't know what you're talking about. Agnes smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Then you won't mind waiting right here for Judge Worthington. He's about an hour behind us. He's a man who values his dignity, so he took the main road. We took the shortcut. We didn't want to miss the party. The next hour was the longest of Josie's life. Crane tried to ride off twice, but the townspeople, brave in their numbers, blocked his path. Polk gave up his badge without a fuss after the blacksmith, a giant of a man named Garrett, suggested it would be a healthier choice. The hired guns vanished into the mountains, just like hired guns do when the tables turn. Judge Worthington finally arrived, looking every bit the part of a man who had served justice for 50 years. With him was Tom Morrison, carrying a leather case full of evidence and looking like a man who'd just set down a heavy burden he'd carried for a decade. Silas, Morrison said, swinging down from his horse. Tom. They looked at each other across 12 years of silence and guilt. I should have spoken up sooner, Morrison said, his voice thick. You're speaking now, Silas replied. That's what counts. The judge held his review right there in the yard with the whole town as a witness. He looked at Morrison's evidence. He took statements from Silas and even a couple of Crane's men, who suddenly found their tongues once they realized how deep the trouble was. He compared the real property documents with Crane's forgeries. By that afternoon, the whole ordeal was finished. Crane and Polk were in chains. The bogus warrants were thrown out, and after 12 long years, folks couldn't call Silas Thorne a coward anymore. His good name was finally restored. Judge Worthington looked at Silas and said, Sir, on behalf of the court, I am truly sorry. Justice failed you, but the men who did this will pay. Silas just nodded. The judge then pointed to Josie. You should be thanking her, he said. She's the one who kept you around to see this day. A little later, Agnes Whitfield came to the porch, looking smaller than before. "Josie," she started, "I said some ugly things in town about you. They were unfair, and they were lies." Josie just looked at her. "I'm sorry," Agnes said. "Robert would have been so ashamed of me." "Robert also would have said you make the finest chicken and dumplings in the territory," Josie replied, a small smile on her face. "And that makes up for a whole lot." Agnes let out a watery laugh and pulled Josie into a tight hug. As the sun went down, the townspeople headed home, their voices warm in the chilly air. They had done something good together, and they knew it. Morrison stayed for supper, and Hattie made sure he ate 2 big bowls of her stew. "That's the best I've eaten since I left the army," he declared. She just set a 3rd bowl down. "You want more," she told him. "You say please." He smiled. "Please, ma'am." After Morrison left, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the silence of strangers or a family on edge. It was a deep-down peace, the kind that comes after weathering a storm together. Bertie was sleeping soundly, and Sam was passed out by the fire, worn out from all the excitement. Hattie sat reading, looking peaceful in the lamplight, while Clementine was at the table drawing something she kept secret. Ezra stood near the door, his hands shoved in his pockets. He looked at Silas, his expression serious. "I owe you something," the boy finally said. Silas shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing." "No, I do," Ezra insisted. "I owe you an apology. From the moment I saw that poster, I treated you like a criminal. I watched you every night, just waiting for you to prove I was right." "You were just protecting your family," Silas said gently. "There's no need to apologize for that." "Maybe," Ezra's voice cracked a little, "but I was also scared. Scared that if I trusted you and you let us down, it would break this family for good." "You're not my papa," Ezra said, his voice quiet. "I don't want you to be, but we need someone. I need someone. I'm only 11 years old, Mr. Thorne, and I am so tired of acting like I'm a grown man." Silas walked over and knelt down in front of the boy, looking him square in the eye. "You've done a man's job, son. Better than most men could. But you're still a boy, and a boy deserves to sleep without worry." He put a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "So here's my offer. I'll watch the door from now on. You go to sleep, and if any trouble comes, I'll wake you. We'll face it together. Not because you can't handle it alone, but because you shouldn't have to." Ezra didn't cry, but he leaned forward and rested his head on Silas's shoulder for just a moment before pulling back. "Deal," he whispered. "Deal," Silas answered. Josie watched them from the doorway, her heart full. She knew she had just seen something sacred happen. Later that night, after all the children were finally asleep, she and Silas sat at the table. "Your sister Ruth wrote you back," Josie said softly, nodding to his letters. "I saw the new one." Silas touched the envelope. "She wants me to come home to Ohio. Says she needs her brother." "And what did you tell her?" Josie asked, holding her breath. "I told her I found something right here in Montana," he said, his eyes finding hers. "Something I wasn't ready to leave. Several someones, actually." Josie reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and sure. "Robert's been gone for 2 years," she said, "and I have spent every single one of those days trying to prove I didn't need anybody." "You are enough, Josie. You've always been." "I know," she said, "but being enough isn't the same as being whole." Her eyes were steady on his. "These children are going to love you, Silas. So if you stay, you have to stay for real. No more running when the road calls. It has to be for good." "Josie Bellamy," he said, his voice low and certain. "I have been yours since the night you saved my life in the snow. The only reason I haven't said it aloud is because I was waiting for you to believe you deserve to hear it." She stood up, came around the table, and put her hands on his face. "Then stay," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am." And then she kissed him. It was a slow, sure kiss between a woman who had made her choice and a man who was finally home. From the loft above, a little voice whispered, "Hattie, are they kissing?" "Sam, shut your eyes," Hattie hissed back. Silas chuckled against Josie's lips, and she laughed with him. Across the room, Clementine held up her new drawing. It showed 6 figures in front of their cabin. But this time, the tall man and the woman stood side by side, their hands touching. Underneath, a child's shaky handwriting had spelled out 2 simple letters. U.S. Spring arrived in the mountains just like that, sudden and loud. The creek roared back to life, and the garden was ready for planting. Birdie took her first steps right into the arms of Silas, and the cabin was filled with the sound of a family, whole and happy at last. Hattie took over the kitchen most mornings, getting bolder with her mother's old recipes and adding her own notes to a blue journal. Ezra chopped wood and mended fences without being asked. For the first time in 2 years, he slept soundly through the night, because he knew a good man was sitting in the chair by the door, keeping watch. The case against Congressman Harrison moved quicker than anyone thought possible. By April, he was stripped of his office and facing a military court. Newspapers all over the territories told the story. Silas's name was finally cleared. He wasn't a deserter anymore, but the hero who saved 12 lives. Letters from his sister Ruth arrived every week, filled with plans and the pure joy of a woman who had her brother back. She was coming in the summer with her daughter Emma, bringing the other half of their broken family home. One evening in late May, Josie found Silas standing on the ridge behind the cabin, at the spot where her husband Robert was buried. He was just holding his hat in his hands, looking out over the valley as the sun went down. He was speaking low to the wooden cross when he heard her footsteps. "Just paying my respects," he said, not quite turning around. Josie came up beside him. "What did you tell him?" "That I would look after this place he built. That his children are strong and stubborn as mules, just like their mother. That I'm not trying to take his place. Just be worthy of it." She slipped her hand into his. "He would have liked you." "You think so?" "He would have said you talk too much, ride too slow, and your coffee is too strong." She squeezed his fingers. "Then he would have shaken your hand and told you, 'Welcome home.'" Below, the homestead glowed in the twilight, a warm mix of chimney smoke and the sounds of their children filling the air. Josie leaned against his shoulder, and he pulled her close. They just stood on the ridge where Robert Bellamy rested. They watched the sun slip behind the mountains, saying nothing, because some moments are too big for words. The whole story was simple, even if the trail to get there was rough. A man went down in a snowstorm. A woman decided to pull him from the cold. Her 5 children, in their own time, chose to make a stranger into kin. A homestead that ran on one woman's pure grit became a sanctuary, a place where busted-up people could piece each other back together. Silas Thorne stopped running from his past the night Josie Bellamy opened her door, and Josie stopped carrying the world on her own shoulders the night she let him inside. That was all there was to it, and that was everything. That was